And video, so we heard weak recovery, high inequality, too much borrowing, lack of housing. Let's see how Mark responds.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I think it's traditional on these sort of occasions that at least one person has to complain about the motion, and even if it isn't traditional, I'm going to. To abandon something, you need to have kind of properly embraced it in the first place, I would suggest. And I think that one of the sorry tales of the situation that Britain has found itself in recent years and even today is not that we have practiced Thatcherism, it's that we haven't embraced it. There's a rider to that. I don't think that everything that Margaret Thatcher did in the 1980s was perfect. In fact, I think some of the things she did weren't even good. And I don't think it's possible to transplant solutions to 1980s problems immediately onto 2014. Those are the riders. But in essence, in principle, let's look at Thatcherism. Let's decide whether we really want to embrace it, or at least the best parts of it, or if we want to abandon it, hook, line and sinker. Well, before we decide that, we've got to make some sort of effort at defining what Thatcherism is. Now, this takes scholars many years to argue over, and I've only got 8 minutes to defend it rather than define it. But I'm going to suggest there were 3 key elements. A suggestion that there should be spending restraint on the part of the government and the public sector, and enthusiasm for deregulation and privatisation, and support for a property-owning democracy in which we would care not particularly about relative poverty levels, but about absolute poverty levels. If the rich were getting way richer and the poor were getting somewhat richer, that was movement in the right direction, even if inequality increased. Let's take each of those in turn. Spending restraint by the government. Margaret Thatcher would always talk about living within your means, trying to run the United Kingdom almost as if it was a house on a household budget, as a housewife would run it. She came in after we had failed monumentally to do so. We have been bailed out by the IMF. Pessimism ruled the land in the 1970s. Kelvin Mackenzie, the former editor of The Sun, said, you've got to remember how bad the 1970s were. If your parents had a crappy house, you were going to have a crappy house. If your parents had a crappy car, you were going to have a crappy car. If your parents had a crappy job, you were going to have a crappy job. It was a bit like North Korea. But without the hope. Now, Kelvin Mackenzie obviously overstated that point somewhat. It wasn't as bad as North Korea. But we did manage our expenditure pretty well. Spending went up under Margaret Thatcher quite markedly, 13% in real terms. But the economy grew even more. We averaged growth of about 3% per annum under Margaret Thatcher. We now seem to be celebrating growth returning to 1.9%. Give me a dose of Thatcherism any time compared to what we've witnessed since. And let's just take some of the things that the proposition are saying. Why does it matter what the size of the state is? Why should we sort of, we shouldn't be ideologically addicted to 38% or 39%. Well, governments of any stripe, red, blue, or blue, yellow, or whatever the present mess is, have only ever been able to raise about 38 or 39% of national income in tax. Whatever the political ideology of the government, whatever the prevailing state of the economy, that's pretty much the maximum the government could bring in. We, and I think Margaret Thatcher, were she alive today, would agree with this, have sought to live beyond those means. In fact, we've been running budget deficits since 2001. Long before the financial crisis hit, we were spending more money than we were bringing in, long before the banks crashed. Warren Buffett was right. He says when you get a huge economic shock, such as the financial crisis, the tide does indeed go out. And when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And we were swimming naked. We were living beyond our means. At the moment, our government, even after the savage cuts of about 0.8% per annum a year in real terms, even after these supposedly savage cuts, we are presently spending about 45 or 46% of GDP in the public sector. This is too high. It is higher than Margaret Thatcher would have countenanced. And to put it into some sort of historical context, if you were to look at some of the fastest growing economies in the world, they have a public sector of about 20%.
Mark, for a point of information, sorry. I should have explained those. I'll pause your timer.
Point of information. I'll take it.
Take it.
So I just want to correct something you said.
Just make a pithy comment.
The pithy comment is that 45% is partly because we're still in the end of a downturn, so lots of spending on welfare benefits, and the system's designed like that. It's the automatic statement as spending goes up when the economy goes down. So actually saying we're spending, the state has grown is just the way...
Well, you've explained why we're spending 45%. Back in 2010, we were spending closer to 50%. These are broadly the numbers. I don't think either political party has a proposal to get it down to something like 25%, which would be the target I was aiming at. You're right, economic growth and a reduction in welfare will push it down, but not enormously. This isn't sudden news that today we're spending 45%. Plus, that's what we've been spending for years. Not under Margaret Thatcher, we've got into the 30s. And to put that into context, the fastest growing economies in the world spend about 20%, there or thereabouts. When Britain was growing at its most rapid, spent about 11% of GDP in the public sector. Most economists agree the Soviet Union spent about 70% of its income in the public sector. So in our complete unwisdom, we in modern Britain today have decided to position ourselves slightly closer to the Soviet Union in terms of overall state spending than to the fastest growing economies in the world. I would suggest to you that that isn't a particularly sensible nor indeed a Thatcherite place to position yourself. Deregulation. Privatisation, tackling producer interests. Back in the 1970s, what was owned by the state? Shipbuilding, buses, cars, aeroplanes, truck manufacturing, gas, iron, oil, power, water, steel, telecommunications, most of the computing industry, most of the television industry, still is, BBC, radio, even some pubs and travel agents were nationalised. That has ended. We have had, under Thatcher, a movement to much better market mechanisms. But unfairly, wrongly, in my view, the financial crash of banks has been laid at the door of Thatcherite free marketeers. We are asked to believe, I think that the term was unfettered markets were allowed to reign in the City of London. That the financial services sector was a kind of devil-may-care, Wild West free market capitalism. Well, the last time I looked at the Financial Services Authority Regulatory Handbook, it contained 10 sections. The section titled Prudential Standards is divided into 11 subsections. The subsection Prudential Sourcebook for Banks, Building Societies and Investment Firms is made up of 14 subsections. The subsection Market Risk is divided into 11 subsections. The subsection of Interest Rates has 66 paragraphs. There are over 1 million paragraphs in the rulebook. Call that what you want. I'm not sure I can call it what I would want to in polite company, but it is certainly not unfettered free market Thatcherite capitalism. It is a socialist regulatory way of organising your banking industry, especially when you bail it out when it fails. That's what we used to do with our motor car industry. That's not Thatcherism. That's not the free market approach. That is a socialist approach to running business. We need to get back to living within our means. We need to re-embrace the idea that the government should only spend what it can raise. We need to not point at highly regulated sectors of the economy that are bailed out by governments and decide to call that Thatcherism when it is exactly the opposite. We are seeing the beginnings of an economic recovery, only the beginnings of it. Let's make sure we build on that by deregulating further, allowing free enterprise and ordinary men and women to pursue their wishes, and getting more and more of the government out of the way. Thank you very much for your time.